Hey, this is Coach Boyston. In this screencast, we're going to be looking at the flow of energy as it goes from the sun and moves through our ecosystems here on Earth. And so, obviously, you see from this picture, you see the sun in the far distance. And what we know is that the energy that runs on this planet originates from the sun. And it's going to make its way to our planet where it then will flow through the organisms that live on this planet. And so the origin of our energy on this planet comes from the sun. And so if we zoom in just a little bit, what we're going to see is we're going to see trees. We go a little closer, we'll see those trees a little closer up. The first organisms that come in contact with this energy from the sun is going to be photosynthetic organisms like trees and grasses, and even algae, things that do photosynthesis and make their own food. And because they make their own food, we call them autotrophs. Auto meaning self, that last part of that word troph meaning feeding. And so these things have the ability to feed themselves. So they're converting that energy from the sun over to a chemical energy of food through photosynthesis. Now that energy that they get from the sun is then transferred over into organisms like our cow here, who is called a heterotroph. He's not an autotroph, he's not self-feeding. He is eating the grass by himself here, but what that means is hetero means different. It means it has to feed on something different. It can't just go stand out in the sun and make its own energy. And so heterotrophs like this cow have to feed on something different. And so the energy that the grass got from the sun is now being transferred into this cow while it eats it. And we call organisms that are heterotrophs that only feed on grass and plants, we call them herbivores. All right, so that energy that it gets from the grass then is going to get transferred into an organism like this guy. Yeah, this guy, right? So kind of this funny picture. I just thought it was funny when I saw it, and so I threw it on there. But so organisms that feed on the cow. And so obviously he is also a heterotroph. He's having to feed on something different. He can't go out in the sun again and just make his own food and stand in the sun. So he's a heterotroph. And more importantly, we call him an omnivore. Now, what omnivores are is organisms that feed on both plants and animals. And you can see he has a little bit of cow, just a little bit, and some veggies in that meal there. Now, so organisms, though, and one that's missing here, organisms that are also heterotrophs are also carnivores. Now, carnivores are just your meat eaters, but they're also heterotrophs as well. So far the energy's flown from the sun into plants, into the cow that ate the plant, into this guy that ate the cow. And then, so from there, obviously, it's made its path. And so if we take a look at it, the sun is where it originated, and it moved into the plants through photosynthesis. And we call these plants producers. They're autotrophs because they're making their own food, but we also call them producers because they're producing food from this process. And then everything else is going to be a consumer. And so once the organisms like our primary consumers here, which are herbivores, organisms that eat only plants, we call them the primary group of consumers, they get the energy by eating those plants. And then your secondary consumers get energy by eating the animal that ate the plants. And so that energy flows through there. And we actually call this a food chain. And so a food chain, when talking about ecology, is just showing one pathway of energy. And you'll notice the arrow is showing you the movement of energy as it moves. Now, the one thing that I left off of this, and we're talking about heterotrophs, is these things called decomposers. Now, decomposers like this fungus you see here growing on this tree, the reason I don't show them in this food chain is they don't just feed on one level here. They actually feed on all levels. And so they're going to feed on this level. They're going to feed on primary consumers and on secondary consumers. And so decomposers are a little different. They don't feed on living matter. They feed on dead organic material. And what they do is they recycle the nutrients back into this system, back into the producers, back into the soil. And so if you can think of things like bacteria that would be feeding upon the skin of this cow, or you've probably heard of a fungus that will grow on your feet, athlete's foot, on this secondary consumer here. Or in this case, you can see the wood getting broken down and decomposed from these dead trees. And so decomposers are recyclers of nutrients back into the system. And so just to show you one other example here of a food chain, and we know the sun's energy gets transferred into producers, into primary consumers, secondary consumers. One thing that I left out on my little example ago is a thing called tertiary consumers. Now tertiary, I want you to think it starts with a T, so does top. These are our top of the food chain organisms. You'll notice there is no arrow here going to something else. It stops there with this top level consumer. So even though this snake is a secondary consumer, and so is this one, it's a secondary consumer, because he's the top of the food chain, there's nothing consuming it, we call it a tertiary consumer. It's the top of the food chain. And again, you'll notice the decomposers feed on all of these levels and recycle those nutrients back into the producers for this food chain. So what brings us to next is something that's a little more complicated. So what I showed you there was just food chains. This is going to be what we call a food web. And what you'll notice is in a food web, it's made up of many food chains that just show many feeding relationships. And so if you're looking at one food chain, we got grass to insects to frog to owl to hawk. We could follow this food chain here from grass to rabbit to lion. All right, so we have multiple feeding relationships going on. Now within these food webs, we have all the things that we've seen before. We have our producers, which is our autotrophs. We have things that only feed on plants, like the moose and rabbit, which are our primary consumers. We have our secondary consumers, and we have our tertiary, like the lion and the hawk, which don't have an arrow going to anything. We can think of all these things in this food web in another way, and that's in the form of a pyramid. And if you look at this pyramid, we actually call these different levels here, these organisms from producers all the way up through this chain, we actually call those trophic levels. And so if you remember, trophic meant feeding. And so if it's a trophic level, it's a feeding level. And so we actually have 1, 2, 3, and 4 trophic levels here. And so it's obvious. What makes up trophic level number 1? Well, it's all of our producers. So if you look over here at your food web, what organisms are going to be at trophic level number 1? Well, your tree is a trophic level number 1, your shrubs, and your grasses. Those are all trophic level number 1. They are producers. And then you'll notice as we go up, we go to trophic level number 2. These are going to be our organisms that only feed on the level below it. So these are going to be our herbivores. And so if we go through our food web on the right, we know that the moose is going to be a trophic level number 2, the rabbit. It looks like the mice only feeds on grass. And the insect only feeds on grass. And so those are all trophic level number 2. And then we go even further, we have trophic level number 3 and 4, and this is going to be our carnivores, our predators for the most part, but some omnivores that feed on both. But how do you tell the difference between a 4 and a 3 when looking at a food web? Well, remember, the 4 is going to be your tertiary consumers, the top of the food chain, so no arrow is going to be going from them. So if we look at this food web up here, we can look here and basically see that the hawk doesn't have any arrows going from it, so it's probably a trophic level number 4. The snake doesn't have any arrows. This may be a bad food web. I really think that probably hawks feed on snakes too. We'll just say they do for this instance. And so the lion doesn't have any arrows going from it, and so we would say it's a 4. And so that means all the other secondary consumers, like the owl, is a trophic level number 3, the frog is a trophic level number 3, and the snake is a trophic level number 3. So again, if you look over here at your pyramid, remember you have 4 trophic levels, at least in this pyramid, and we know that pyramids come up to a point they get smaller as we go up. It's going to be really important to understand because as we go up through these trophic levels, these feeding levels, what gets less is energy. Another thing that gets less is biomass. And so let's talk about that a little bit. If we go to this diagram, this one's on energy. You'll notice as we go up through the different levels, the trophic levels, from producers to primary consumers to secondary to tertiary, it gets less and less or smaller and smaller. There's the rule of 10%. Only about 10% of the energy produced at one level will get up to the next level. Only 10% up to here. That's why it goes from 10,000 to 1,000, from 1,000 to 100, from 100 to 10. Only 10% of the energy is getting passed on. So why is that? Well, plants got to live. They got to use energy. So about 90% of the energy is going to be used up by plants just doing what plants do. This grasshopper here, only 10% of its energy is going to get passed on because that grasshopper uses up a lot of the energy just living life until it gets eaten. So on and so on. So energy gets less and less as we go up through these trophic levels. Another example here is this thing called biomass. Now remember, bio means life, mass means just how much stuff, all right? It makes that up. So in this case, how many individual organisms are there within this ecosystem? So this ecosystem is a Michigan bluegrass field, and so you can see here we have a total number of organisms. In this field, there's just under 6 million primary producing organisms. That's pretty high. So the highest biomass amount of stuff, all right, living matter, is here in our producers. And then as you go up to the consumers, there's only about 708,000 primary consumers. That means organisms that feed only on that level, the grasses. And then you have 354,000 roughly secondary consumers and only 3 tertiary consumers, top of the food chain. So it goes to this idea, if energy is getting less each group, well then obviously if there's less energy, then there's less to support more organisms within each one of those levels. So energy gets less as we go through these trophic levels, so does the amount of organisms making up each one of those levels, or we call that biomass. And so if I pull this back up and we take a look at these two things again, if I was to ask you a question about this food web and say which organisms represent where the highest amount of biomass is going to be found, well again, the highest amount of biomass, look back over our pyramid, is here in our producers. That's the highest. So where's the highest amount of biomass going to be found? Here in our producers here on the food web. Where's the lowest amount of biomass? Well, that's going to be up here with our tertiary consumers. So in this case, that's going to be up here with our hawk and our lion. We're going to find the lowest amount of biomass. And does energy work the same way? Absolutely. So the highest amount of energy is going to be found down here with our producers. That's where most of the energy is being produced. And then the lowest amount of energy is going to be found up here with our tertiary consumers. So as we move up through this pyramid, up through the energy levels, the feeding levels, energy gets less and biomass gets less. And so that was the flow of energy. Hopefully that was all helpful to you. That was food webs, food chains, and just how energy makes its way from the sun and through ecosystems here on our planet. So, I'm Coach Boyston. You have a good day.